you're able to explain the benefits of active learning on retention and engagement, to describe some strategies and techniques for active learning, both in person and online, to discuss strategies for structuring your session to promote engagement and retention, to describe effective use of text and visuals based on some design principles, and also to think about recognizing opportunities for cultural sensitivity and inclusion as you approach your session design and also your overall review. So last time we talked a bit about making sure that we're able to clearly define higher order thinking for both yourself and your learners, to identify those goals and objectives. And we spent a lot of time talking about Bloom's taxonomy, reviewed some examples of what were both strong and weaker learning objectives. You had the opportunity to write your own. And then we discussed some possibilities in terms of assessment modalities for our learning objectives, the different levels of Kirkpatrick. And here we are. So now we're going to talk a bit more about active learning and session design. So we would be remiss not to mention adult learning theory here. This was developed actually quite a long time ago, 1960s, 1970s, some of the early literature came out, and essentially it's the study of how adults learn. And at its core, there are some key assumptions about adult learners, and there are also 4 core principles, and these are them. That adults need to be involved in the planning and evaluation of their instruction. That experience, which can include the opportunity to make mistakes, provides the basis for learning activities. That adults are most interested in learning subjects that have immediate relevance and impact to either their job or their personal life. And that adult learning is problem-centered rather than content-oriented. And so as we discuss various strategies for active learning and why we make things active, it's important to keep this in the back of our mind, right? So are we involving our adult learners in the planning? Are they able to evaluate the instructions? Are we giving them experiences that they can build upon and problem solve independently? Is the content that we're teaching them immediately relevant to the work that they're expected to do? And again, are we being problem-centered rather than content-centered? So adult learning theory provides key principles upon which session design can be built. It teaches us to be thoughtful and deliberate in how we are creating our learning experiences. So active learning is not a single method. Rather, it's an approach to teaching. It's an approach to curricular design. It is a model of instruction in which learners engage with materials through a variety of methods. And this can include reading, it can include discussion, which would be talking and listening. It can include writing, problem solving. We also like to use reflection a lot. And the learning here is really based on a shared responsibility between the educators and the learners. And the educators and the learners are partners in learning. Active learning can facilitate learner engagement, enhance relevance, improve motivation by actively involving learners in experiences within the learning environment. So we're going to start out, and this is our one breakout room for today, and we're going to give about 5 minutes for this, but we'd like for everybody to recall the learning objective that you wrote last time, or a similar learning objective, or something that you hope to accomplish when approaching a session with those that you teach. And if everybody could discuss, maybe you do some things that already make that session active. If you don't, what are some potential things that you could think about or that you could do to actively engage learners, make the content relevant, all those principles that we just discussed in terms of adult learning theory. So we'll give you about 5 minutes here, and then we'll bring it back together and see what the discussions were.
All right, opening the rooms now.
Okay, so welcome back. Any volunteers to share with us? Maybe what they hope to accomplish in a session, but ways that they've made their sessions active, or ways that they've seen others do things, or maybe a best practice approach that you're aware of. Feel free to unmute your mic, or also to use the chat function and share some of your conversation through there.
or some of us didn't finish even holding the discussion yet. We didn't finish, it was just starting as the time I think was kind of short.
And we will continue to be having some opportunities for you to share things through the chat and back in discussion or back in breakout rooms later on. So please do feel free to, if you didn't get all of your information shared with your group, feel free to, if you feel comfortable, put some things through the chat as well. I know,
but for it was important for me because I think I had people with experience in the field, and whatever they were sharing, I think I found it very important. It was a really nice learning session for me.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And that's why it's everyone around the Zoom room here, I know, has great experiences and different experiences with different level learners and different teaching situations. So love the opportunity to continue to learn from and with all of you.
One thing in the chat for having illustrations, audio guides, visual illustrations, even showing videos, right? We did that last time. Examples of patient-physician interactions, great, great suggestion.
I just came from teaching a class and we used technology. We used Poll Everywhere to do an anticipatory set or introductory activity where we were just trying to get a better understanding of where everyone was in understanding the term systems thinking and what does that mean. So we had a question where we did a word cloud and said, what does systems thinking mean to me? And we asked for everyone in the group to put that in that way. And then we asked for people to reflect on that and come back together and discuss.
Just a really nice example of a way to make even online learning active. And I might have shared this last time, but in the work, I'm taking a course right now on curricular design and assessment, and it's a completely asynchronous course, or mostly asynchronous, and we respond to discussion prompts based on the reading that we read, and as part of the course requirements, are required to respond to others' prompts to create an online community of active engagement.
We'll see if anyone else has other ideas or things that you would like to share along the way. Again, please do feel free to put those things in the chat. But we're gonna, spend a little bit of some time talking about additional active learning strategies and ways that you might be able to incorporate that with your learners and either current teaching situations or situations in the future. And one of the things that we do have to keep in mind is audience size. And depending on what that group of learners might look like and whether or not you are going to be keeping them always in that large group, or if there are different opportunities for them to do some things in smaller groups, both within your course or maybe asynchronously as well, there are some different things in consideration. So as we think about your larger group sizes that might be traditionally more didactic, there are different ways that you could incorporate some low tech or more tech heavy tools to promote audience participation and engagement. Whereas as you get into smaller, medium-sized groups within that group, so again, it could be a large number that you break down into medium-sized groups, you can use things that are more considered in alignment with a team-based learning or using some team-based learning approaches. And then you can also be thinking about problem-based learning or case-based learning. And oftentimes in those types of formats, you're going to have smaller groups of learners. Again, you might come back into a larger group and bring everyone together, but typically you will see that that's going to happen in a smaller size with a instructor or educator serving more as a facilitator and having the learners take more of an active role in their teaching. So as we think then about problem-based learning, oftentimes when we think about problem-based learning, there are some main concepts or definitions or constructs we think about. So problem-based learning often includes some type of detailed open-ended scenario that is simulating or based on real-life authentic opportunities for application or situations, where students will be focusing on not just developing their knowledge base, but also practicing essential skills such as communication, problem solving, leadership, teamwork, collaboration, and so forth. When you look at problem-based learning, you will often have some key components where there'll be some type of task that the group is responsible for completing that will also, like I said, include some aspect of content, but then a lot of focus on process and communication and developing those social skills and solving problems by doing those. There often will include some opportunities for either role playing or taking on or assuming those professional roles and responsibilities. And so again, the more you can have that be as similar to an authentic experience as possible, the better. And then providing learners with resources or curating a few resources that they might find to be helpful and useful as they are going about approaching and trying to solve the problem, as well as potentially, if you're developing some of their self-directed learning skills, wanting to give them some of those tools for appraising different resources, finding their own, and then bringing that back and actually having that be part of the discussion and conversation as well. Within problem-based learning, you will often see that there are some questions and tasks and assignments that again get at not just the content or problem they're trying to solve, but also reflecting on the process and potentially identifying and incorporating some personal reflection and self-assessment, where they are going to have certain activities or assignments to do or deliverables, but then might also be reflecting on their performance as a group, as well as their own individual performance. And within this, you will see that the instructor is much more of a facilitator or coach, that they are going to be standing by to help guide and maybe amplify or ensure that learners are on track and moving in the right direction. But there will not be as much of an emphasis for the facilitator to be delivering content, or to be, if we think back to our teaching perspectives, certainly not within the transmission perspective. So when you think about PBL and how that could be used within your classroom or within your curriculum or program or course that you're teaching in, there often is the design development of a problem or scenario that's introduced, and some identification of the fact. Learners within their groups would be generating some type of hypothesis or coming up with generating some ideas for how they might go about approaching solving or addressing that problem or that task. They will take some time to figure out what they already know versus where are some learning opportunities. How will they go about doing the learning themselves? So are they going to be doing some of that, dividing it up individually, doing some of those things together, spending some time doing that self-directed learning, coming back together, applying that new knowledge, and then potentially repeating that process for another problem or another scenario that they might be posed. There are variations, of course, on PBL, but in general, students will be taking, again, charge of their own learning, in which they will be looking to identify how much they know about a specific topic where they might need to focus some of their time, what resources they will use, going out and using those resources, coming back together as a group, bringing those things together, clarifying their understanding, potentially having some opportunities for some synthesis and some consolidation, identifying their approach or their answer to the solution, and then presenting their solutions. And again, oftentimes we try to have that presentation be in as authentic of a situation as possible. So sometimes this might be actually allowing for learners to be presenting to a panel of experts from the field, or to those who might be actually directly impacted by whatever their solution is designed to address. As we mentioned before, educators or teachers are serving much more in a facilitative role, and being able to provide some different strategies or tools to use related to the process, or to related to thinking and those self-directed learning skills, and then using some of those open-ended questions to help students to unpack what has been working, what are some things that they might want to work towards doing differently as they are going into and throughout all of the stages of PBL. Case-based learning is very similar to PBL, but there are a few differences. And again, implementation might look a little bit different, right? So these are going to be some things that potentially you might adapt based on whatever your particular context is, or whatever the content is and skills that you are trying to develop. But oftentimes there's going to be a little bit more advanced preparation that's required by the learner before even going into that group session. The faculty will provide a little bit more direction. So there's a little bit of a more shared responsibility, certainly leading more on the students than the faculty. But if we were to look at a continuum of faculty being completely hands-off to being completely directing the learning experience, I'd say they're probably in the lower part of a little bit less hands-off than what you would see in problem-based learning or project-based learning. So there'll be a little bit more of that guided inquiry and helping to tease out and facilitate what areas to be focusing on, and potentially to prioritizing different tasks or components of the case that they're working on. Many of you have probably incorporated variations of problem-based, project-based, or case-based learning in your own situations. So I'd love to just see through the chat if people are willing to share some examples of problems, cases, or projects that you have incorporated and allowed for learners to really focus on the process as well as some of the content and mastering some of those skills that are essential for their success, both as learners and future professionals within their fields. And if people find it easier to unmute and to share a little bit more verbally, that's fine as well. I know that might be easier for some than sending something through the chat at this point.
I think one example, and I, pushing myself to think of a non-medical, non-clinical example. We did a session with our residents in the last academic year, which focused largely on professionalism development, which is something that is shared across all of the disciplines that everybody on this call works, right? So we did a flipped model classroom approach where we asked our residents to pretend that they were our clinical competency committee. And we gave them case examples and role playing of residents who have had issues with professionalism and asked the group to work through, given the resources that we presented to them, how they may design a learning plan for somebody with a professionalism issue. How would they go about approaching it? What systems are there in place? What resources do they have? So that was a nice example of a problem-based learning with some role playing, with different active modalities, but with resources provided that allowed the learners to access those resources and creating their own answer and bridging some of those gaps in their learning. The faculty present really were more facilitators and guides, and we did provide a facilitation guide for our faculty who came, so that they would be able to, follow along and know, what advanced planning needed to be done on their end.
Thanks. That's a great example. And I see that Elaine has also shared that CBL, case-based learning, is used a lot in dental education because that aligns with their ultimate assessments with their dental board format. One of the other examples that I was thinking about, Dr. Kaye, as you were just explaining yours, was within some faculty development or teacher preparation, whether it's with our students as educators, our residents as educators, or even our faculty development programs, is sometimes providing some different types of cases in which there would be a dilemma that an educator is facing about how a lesson went. Because we've all had those, right? We've all had those experiences where you work really hard to go to class and you're interacting with the learners or within a session or a workshop, and it just doesn't go as well as you liked. Right. So sometimes bringing some of those cases or challenges to the group and having people take that on as themselves, or thinking about it, if you were going to be serving in the coaching model and providing some feedback to this educator who came to you, a colleague who said, I tried to do it this way. This is what happened. This is the feedback from the students. Those are some other ways that you could potentially have some, doesn't require a lot of preparation. It doesn't require a lot of work, but allows for people to bring different perspectives, expertise, and really work on fine-tuning some of those skills as educators that we're helping that people to develop in problem solving and troubleshooting some of the everyday challenges that we face.
Even in the chat, one of our colleagues suggested, Carmelo mentioned about writing a short software code. That might be, what the end of the problem-based learning session does. That might be, what the task is at the end, but how are you going to get your learners there? What sort of resources are you going to provide them? What kind of questions are you going to ask them? Will it be up to them to divide up the group and determine who's going to do what? So that's a really great example of a tangible outcome that a group could work on in a problem-based learning type of environment. Shifting gears slightly to team-based learning, which is one of my personal favorites. So team-based learning, and now we're talking about a little bit of a larger group size. So if we remember that pyramid that we showed a few slides ago, we're kind of in the middle realm there. It's an evidence-based teaching strategy designed in a 3-step cycle, which includes preparation, in-class readiness assurance testing or in-class testing, followed by application-focused exercises. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. First, talking about the importance of individual preparation here. So students are assigned preparatory materials to review. This could be a journal article. This could be a video to watch. This could be a podcast to listen to. Whatever the preparatory material is, it should highlight the foundational vocabulary and the most important concepts that the students need to be able to begin problem solving. It should not include everything that the student needs to know by the session end or by the module end. So you're giving them just enough of that foundational material for them to begin to apply it, begin to bridge connections, and then build off of those connections that they're going to make. One of the largest criticisms of team-based learning with trainees is that they don't have time to complete the assigned preparatory materials. And one way to potentially get around that is to build in some of that protected time. So maybe you're doing a 2-hour session, maybe the preparatory material is the first 20 minutes of that session. Maybe it's a didactic that you give to them, hitting the high yield information. That's what I personally do. Maybe it's an article that will take them 10 or 15 minutes to read. So it's great if they can do it on their own time, but if that's a barrier for you and the time that you have with them, you can roll it into the overall time allotted for the session. Thinking about readiness assurance. So readiness assurance, when students are ready to start the TBL session, they complete a multiple choice question set on their own. This is called the IRAT, or the Individual Readiness Assurance Test. This holds students accountable for acquiring that important foundational knowledge from the preparatory materials. So in a lot of courses that use TBL or focus on TBL heavily, they will collect those pre-tests and factor that into part of the student's grade, right? We do this in our musculoskeletal course that we teach the medical students. You know, they have various topics that are discussed, many of them via a TBL-based learning format. And so they need to have a certain percent completion on their individual readiness testing as an aggregate to meet the requirements of the course. The questions are typically written at Bloom's levels of remembering, understanding, and simple applying. So again, the individual test is mapped onto those preparatory materials. It's the need to know information at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Following this, then the exact same test is completed as a group. And this is where it starts to get fun. The teams, right? You have the whole classroom broken into groups of 5 or 7. 5 tends to be a pretty good number, but teams must negotiate the answers. So if you picked A and your colleague picked B, you have to come up to a consensus answer. So this really sponsors a lot and fosters a lot of peer learning and near peer learning, right? The other thing about completing the preparatory materials is that if the learners are familiar with a TBL format, they know that they're going to have to defend their answers to their colleagues. And it inherently allows them to, pushes them to prepare for the session because they want to be able to contribute with their peers, right? Once the team has a consensus answer, then they scratch off, and there's all of these TBL like scratch off cards you can purchase relatively inexpensively. I don't even do that. I just give them a paper that says circle the answer that your group comes to for a consensus answer. But if we're following the TBL textbook, that's what they do. And they scratch their first consensus answer. They're trying to find the correct answer. And that correct answer would be given by a star. So these are really high energy learning events, the team readiness tests. And some things that people who focus heavily on TBL do over the course of a course would be, you know, assigning a trophy at the end or some reward that the team that has had the highest team readiness assurance tests would receive. So this is what, it's a little bit blurry, but this is what a TRAT test can look like, right? So they're scratching it off, they're trying to find those stars. And it is really critically important that the groups are properly formed. So if you have multiple learner levels, you know, maybe you have a first-year student, second-year student, third-year student. Well, hopefully, you know, there's at least one third-year student in each of the groups. Or if it's all within the same group and you know those learners well, that you have the talent equally distributed amongst the groups. That's really to also team development. And if you're going to be doing multiple TBL sessions, to keep the groups the same. It allows for people to learn from one another to build that sense of camaraderie and the team-based approach and develop the sense of team. An interesting part about this, which is always fun as an educator is that students can appeal. So if they got an answer wrong and the group really felt that that answer was the correct answer, then they have the opportunity after the session to give a written appeal. And a clear statement of the argument and evidence that they've cited from the preparatory materials as to why they feel their answer is correct. I gave a team-based learning on team-based learning a couple of years ago to medical educators, and I was going through this, they actually filed an appeal. They're like, I don't think that this is the right answer. I think it could be A or B, so we're going to write a appeal, and they did it in live time, and we laughed and we gave it to them, and it was fun. But they do have the process to appeal, but it has to be rooted in the evidence. After this, there's a mini lecture. So the instructor focuses on a short didactic session and can focus on the concepts that are still problematic for the students. So after facilitating that discussion between the teams in terms of why the answers they chose were correct, the instructor is able to quickly look and see how many groups got one wrong, how many groups got two wrong. And then as they're going through their didactic material, can focus in on areas of uncertainty that are needed for clarification. And so this takes us on the whole spectrum from initial preparation to true readiness. And now we're going to talk about application exercises. So an individual does their pre-reading, they come to the session, they do their individual readiness test, they submit it, then they talk in their group and try to come up with consensus answers for the multiple choice questions. Those are given to the instructor. Maybe there's an appeal, and then the instructor performs a mini didactic, and now coming to application exercises. So these are group-based. They give individuals and teams many opportunities to make decisions and get timely feedback on the quality of their thinking. So it has to be a relevant problem that you're asking the group to solve that captures their interest. And the quality of the problem controls the effectiveness of the application activity. You don't want to make the question so easy that they all, come up with a consensus within 30 seconds, and there's no discussion that's really fostered between the groups. So it has to be sufficient for them to be able to defend, challenge, discuss, and examine each other's thinking. So one way that we do this is we'll ask we'll give a short didactic, we'll ask a group-based multiple choice question, we'll have the groups discuss it, and then we'll say, at the count of 3, everybody can raise their piece of paper with their answer. 1, 2, 3, it's raised. And then the instructor gets to look around the room and say, okay, there's a B, there's a C, there's a D. That's what you want, because then you want to be able to call on the groups and have them explain their line of thought, their rationale, and their reasoning. And so with this 4S framework, the problem has to be a significant problem. They all have to work on the same question or the same problem at the same time. They have to have specific choices, which is why multiple choice works well for this. They have to pick either A, B, C, or D. And then they report it all simultaneously to allow the instructor to really facilitate discussion between the groups. So looking at team-based learning versus problem-based learning, in team-based learning, there's required pre-reading. It's a pretty structured format. If you attend a TBL session, there will be individual prep, an IRAT, a TRAT, a lecture, and then application exercises. And it can accommodate larger groups of students, as we mentioned, with fewer faculty members. It's both learner and instructor centered, and it includes formative assessment, right? They're doing those individual tests, they're doing group tests. It gives you a nice assessment modality already built in to the format in and of itself. Versus problem-based learning, which Dr. Meka was just talking about, right, may not include specific pre-reading, includes a self-directed learning guide, can accommodate smaller groups, but you typically have to have a faculty member present for each of those groups. Not always, but most of the time. It's very learner-centered. The teacher is more of a guide, and there's usually not a built-in formative assessment modality. It's important to remember that you can do hybrids of these two, right? So you can include a pre-reading assignment for your PBL. You may include one specific question prompt that the PBL group works on together to solve. My favorite between all of these is TBL, but it's a hybrid TBL that relies more heavily on a longer didactic session. So there's a lot of different ways that you could be creative and pick and choose pieces of these modalities that work best for you, depending on how many learners you have, what is the level of the learner, and also what's your faculty support. If you have one faculty member, maybe TBL is the better choice. If you've got 10 faculty members, maybe PBL is the better choice. But it's not an all or nothing kind of approach here.
And I think that, one of the things that you just brought up too, that's really important, Dr. Kaye, to amplify is that it is very much, if you are holding true to the principles in terms of what it is that you want your students or your learners to be getting out of the experience and the activity, you can certainly tweak some of the main pieces in terms of the length of time you spend, or whether or not you are able to use technology or not technology, or if you end up needing to use, maybe previous students, returning students as facilitators, rather than having enough facilitators. Does that get you, depending on the level of interaction and guidance you want the instructors to be having? So I think that allows for a little bit of some flexibility and some creativity there, while also being able to think about what's going to help you to achieve the overall goals and objectives for that learning experience.
So we're going to transition to engaging learners now in didactic sessions. So we're at the bottom of the pyramid with the largest groups, and we'll start here.
And so there are a lot of different ways that you probably are doing this yourselves, or you have seen this done in a variety of different sessions as well. So what we'd like you to do is just to take a moment and think about an effective lecture or research presentation or teaching session that you participated in, and what made it effective, and what are some examples or some of the things that you've seen in lectures, PowerPoints, talks that maybe were not as effective, because we all have, I'm sure, participated in that and potentially it made some of those mistakes ourselves. And again, if you are able to send things through the chat, you can do that. Or if you're in a situation where it might be easier just for you to unmute, you can certainly do that as well.
One of the courses that I'm participating in with another faculty is graduate teaching PhD student how to write a grant proposal. So we have them break into small group and dissect each portion of the funded proposal and explain the differences between evidence summary and evidence synthesis. And how they're utilized in different part of the grant proposal. And then they have to report in a big group with their justification.
That's great. And that's a really nice example of something that they are doing that's very obviously authentic, right? And using the actual content and format that they'll need to be using, or that they're working towards. And obviously highly motivated individuals wanting to be able to ensure are learning the best from those skills, but then being able to hear different people's perspectives in those conversations can be very helpful as well. When they do that, do they do that in small groups with guided facilitation, or do they do that in small groups and then just come back and debrief with the facilitation or facilitators?
In the small group, and they have specific section of the grant that they focus on. Like this one group would have to focus on the background significance section, and the other one look at the aim statements.
Oh, gotcha.
Then the research proposal section and share.
Excellent. Very nice. I'm seeing some additional things people are putting in the chat about effective things. So simplifying complex ideas, topics with visuals or drawing out pathways, non-effective tone of speech, pace of communication. You have seen some common themes here about clarity, simplifying things, people using different tools such as Top Hat, right? Yes, so that includes a variety of different types of questions that you could ask, whether those are multiple choice, true, false, discussion-based, and students have found that to be helpful. We probably have all been in situations where someone reads a lot of text to the audience, and whether that's word for word or a summary of what is written there. I'm sure that at some point, one of us have also set in a session or perhaps done it ourselves, or there's a lot of information and very small, and you might say something like, or here it said, I'm sure you can't read all of this, but, and they go on to tell you what's included there. Might not be as effective. Oh, yes. So yes, the charisma and engagement of the actual presenter, including personal anecdotes and stories. Yes, absolutely. And not having enough time to digest information. Very good. So I'm going to just share with you in the chat, and there are many different resources out there. This is just one in particular that I love. And we had the honor of hosting Dr. Doug Buller from the Wilson Center at the University of Toronto, whose job basically is to help their research scientists tell their stories in engaging ways and help them put together presentations. So during COVID, he had some extra time where people were not doing as much in person. And he put together a series of videos that you can see on that YouTube channel that I sent you the link to. For those of you who might have presentations about your work or research presentations or trainees who are involved in that, absolutely love Doug's work, and he has some great suggestions and recommendations. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But basically some of the things that he talks about and that we think are important to highlight as you're thinking about presentations. And again, that might not necessarily be your traditional teaching session. It could also be thinking about a oral presentation at a conference or a research day and so forth. But thinking about what's the overall framework, the timing, what do you include within the actual slides themselves, as well as thinking about the content that's presented and what that format might be. And so when we think about any type of teaching session or interaction that you might be having at a meeting or with stakeholders, activating or finding out what their prior knowledge is, as well as being able to take it and find ways to draw it in to help lead them into whatever the key areas are or activity or learning that you want them to do or what problem you want them to address. So being able to take a little bit of some time to find out what people already know and to use that then to guide instruction or to guide the pacing, as well as the level of detail that you go into at different sections is very helpful. That requires you as a leader, as a presenter, as a speaker, to be a little bit flexible and adaptive in that presentation, which may or may not work in all situations. But if you come into a group where you find that everyone is very familiar with or has a lot of experience on the topic that you're going to be addressing, then you could probably go over or more quickly go through some of if you had a significant portion of time dedicated to basics or foundations that you might be introducing them to. It's also helpful if this is part of a course or a series or a workshop or part of the work that they're going to be doing, to situate where that fits in within the course of what else they'll be learning, what they've learned so far, where they're going next, or how this applies, or how you hope they'll be able to use that in the future.
Can I add something about the activation?
Absolutely.
I think what's really nice is when you're activating prior knowledge, you are activating prior knowledge for some people, but because of the discussion or the activity that you choose to do, you're building background for other people who don't have that knowledge. And so that's really important. I think a lot of people skip the anticipatory set, the activation of prior knowledge. And I think it's a missed opportunity because you're helping to build background for some people who don't have it, and then they're able to contribute more to the actual lesson.
Thank you so much, for Catherine, for sharing that, for bringing that to the group's attention, because I completely agree. And we talk about sometimes in learning this idea of preparation for future learning. And so that's where this can really come into play, is that it allows for that preparation for future learning. And sometimes people will be a little bit hesitant to incorporate that type of strategy because they're like, well, what if someone says the wrong thing, right? Or they have a misunderstanding of the group. But what we actually find, and what the literature has demonstrated, is that people don't remember the wrong answers and the misinformation, right? What it does is, again, it helps set the stage for that. And if you do end up needing to do some clarifying or addressing some misconceptions or expanding upon that information, exactly what Catherine said, which is you've already set up that starting point for everyone and are able to makes it easier for you to build off of it, and people don't remember the incorrects or the misinformation. One of the things that we often get asked a lot in terms of, I'm getting ready to give a talk and it's an hour, how many slides should it be, right? And oftentimes what you'll see is that people err on the side of having a lot of slides and think that they'll be able to go through some of it more quickly than others. One of the things that, and this is again, not like a rule, and there's, not a whole lot of, I'm going to say firm evidence related to this, but oftentimes people will say you thinking about 1 to 1.5 minutes per slide. So that if you were to have, a 60-minute session with a 30-minute lecture, you might have 20 minutes of active learning, 10 minutes of question and Q&A, and then the number of slides that you might have within that PowerPoint might vary. But if you think about 1 to 1.5 minutes per slide, but again, depending on how you personally like to do things, like I don't like to use a lot of transitions, animations. I don't like things kind of flying in and out on the PowerPoint. But I might have a couple of what look from the outset as duplicative slides, because one might have the first bullet point of the agenda that's there and clear, and the rest it makes it lighter because those are items we haven't gotten to yet. But then in the next time I pull it up, it might be darker. And again, it's not that I then am going to spend a lot of time on those. So it might look like there are a lot of slides, but there actually aren't, because of just the way that I set things up and don't like to technically use the transitions or some of the different animation tools. When you think about what should be then included when you're giving a talk, or when you're giving a lecture, or having a meeting or a session, always starting with that objective slide and making sure that you're thinking about that alignment, right? So you want to be thinking about, what is it that I want our learners to be able to do? And then ensuring that whatever you are looking towards in terms of your assessments or outcomes or things that you would be able to see are going to be then aligned with the amount of, not only the amount of time, but also the activities that you're going to be doing, or how you divide your time and use your time. And then there are a few different multimedia design principles that can be really helpful. And again, there are some other things that Doug Buller talks about in that lecture series, and a few others that we can share too, if that's an area that you're interested in. So one of the very first things that we often will see, and I would say that this is not necessarily an indication of our own skills, but if you look at things like PowerPoint and the templates that they have set up that are automatically in there, quite a few of the templates themselves that are built in there, or in Prezi, or in other types of presentation software, those are actually not really based on multimedia design principles. And so there's a lot of research that has been done. Richard Mayer is one of the individuals who I would say is likely has the most seminal works related to this, and you can go really deep into some of his stuff. But there's a whole lot of research going on now, especially when we look at online learning and things related to eye tracking and how that relates to overall comprehension, retention of material, application, transfer of knowledge and skills, and so forth. So one of the things that you will often see is that people will have the words and the text showing up at the same time, and that they will be pretty much in line with one another. So somebody would actually be reading it. But what we know is that from a processing perspective, both your auditory and your visual processing, you don't want to have the same amount of cognitive load on both, right? Because that then becomes too much cognitive load and hard for people to be focusing on one or the other. So the recommendation would be that you would have some bulleted information, and you might give verbally more detail than what is included, but using some of that same language and going in the same sequence of events there. Additionally, you might think about things like the visuals that you might have in terms of a graphic. So you don't need to necessarily have a graph and have a list of bullet points that would be emphasizing what you're going to verbally be pointing out that's in the graph or in that visual. So you would have the visual and then verbally have it, or you could have the bullet points and then verbally say it as well. So be thinking about and mindful of not overloading those areas. Similarly, as we think again about both the auditory and the visual processing channels that we know are really important, splitting your attention actually splits the viewer's attention. And they have done a lot of studies looking at this, again, bringing people in where they'll go through both in-person sessions as well as some online content, doing eye tracking, and then looking at comprehension or recall later on. And when you have information that is a visual and would have the text, that oftentimes is then going to have some of this back and forth. When they look at eye tracking, they see that back and forth, in which then helps, or I'm sorry, can oftentimes deter individuals from more easily synthesizing that information and coming to conclusions for that. So picking one or the other, I think, would be what the recommendations are. So having a visual and having some explanation of it, or having that text. One of the other things that is a big drawback, or a thing that we discourage people from doing as it relates to split attention, is when people might include a graphic that might, or an image that maybe is interesting or appealing, but maybe doesn't actually reinforce or have as much to do with the message itself, because you're more likely to remember one or the other. And if they aren't emphasizing the same thing, or aren't helping to reinforce the same thing, then that is actually going to dissuade or have some potential issues with retention in the future.
One question in the chat about, could you put the graphic on one slide and then the bullet points which summarize the graphic on another slide?
Absolutely, yes. So doing that way, and then it would really be up to you as a presenter to figure out, depending on the complexity of the topic or the depth that you want your participants to go to, that you would decide which one made most sense to go first. In some situations, if it's something that people might be familiar with and the visual is going to help them and be easy to see first, versus if it's a really complex topic and you feel like having it laid out in bullet points, that's where, you know, your experience as an expert and someone in the field would be able to make some decisions about what went first. Further, another option would be, you could do the visual, and then part of what you could be asking your audience to be doing as well is to identify what their key takeaways are from that graphic or from that image or from that visual. And that would be a way that you could potentially incorporate some active learning strategies as well. When we think about segmentation, you oftentimes will think about segmentation in which you'll be able to see that you can potentially jump ahead to different things, right? So you know where you are in learning, what might be coming next. You might be able to move from one section to the next into the next. So really having smaller bits or chapters or sections of information. And so one of the things that we know from, again, a memory and retention principle is that the more that you can have things segmented, you can have things broken down into smaller chunks, the easier it is for people to move through those different phases and to then be able to remember some of those discrete pieces of information with more granularity and more specific detail. One of the ways that you can do that as well is by presenting that agenda or that outline and identifying what you'll be doing. And that potentially could be like an agenda with some timelines, or it could be using the format of your objectives, right? And making sure that you are going in those orders, in that order of the objectives. One of the things that oftentimes I've seen educators do to help learners to see where they're going, and also to build in some assessment, is to then bring the objectives up multiple times throughout the session, so that you might see at the beginning, here are the 4 or 5 objectives we're going to cover, and then here's the first one. And then you go through it, and then you get to a point where it's almost like a guidepost for learning and for the session. So if you were to then, after you've talked about the items for the first objective, you might bring it back up and ask some questions or have some knowledge check related to that. And then after that, you would then identify and have some emphasis on the second objective. And then that's what you would be going into. Again, almost using it as, think of like a table of contents, again, or some type of overview of more of an agenda or an outline for this session, that again is using the same language that they saw in the objective, that hopefully aligns with the assessments that you'll be incorporating as well.
One question in the chat about what would be the recommendations around using analogy to enhance an in-depth understanding of a complex idea. I find that some get it and some don't. I think with this, we have to remember our cultural responsiveness, because some analogies there may be a cultural component to it, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit towards the end. If it's a straightforward analogy and you feel like it would benefit the majority of the class and it's quick to present that, 30 seconds, a minute of the session that you're giving, there's probably not a whole lot of downside. But making sure that you're testing this on an audience, you try it the first time. If they didn't get it, the next time you give the talk, you're probably not going to use it. But analogy can be a great way to break down very complex ideas or levels of understanding.
I completely agree. And I actually have found that in order to address some of those issues, because in my mind, an analogy might make sense. But again, depending on our familiarity with the content, as well as some of the cultural importance considerations as well, I will oftentimes have that actually be one of the assignments or activities that I'll incorporate into a class or into a session, is to ask them to come up with an analogy, whether that's a simile, a metaphor, or if you want to keep it more broad. And then those are things that you can bring forward with other learners in the future, because again, different analogies might connect or resonate differently with different individuals.
Okay. Allegory, I think of that more as trying to uncover a hidden meaning. Analogy being you're trying to illustrate an example. So when I use an analogy in teaching for me, it's usually about autoimmune disease. And I just did this yesterday when I was teaching the third year medical students, that in autoimmune disease, it's as if your body is a house and that house is on fire. And the reason why that house is on fire is because there's a slow gas leak. So the first thing we do is put out the fire, for which we use prednisone. The second thing that we do is address that slow gas leak, for which we use medications like Humira, depending on what the rheumatic disease is. So that's an analogy. I'm trying to illustrate a more complicated example there. I'm not trying to have them uncover any kind of hidden meaning. So I think there is a slight difference potentially between the two there. Speech speed and occasional pause to allow processing. Yes, I do speak quickly. It's something I have to be cognizant about, and many of us, I'm sure, do. And really allowing for the pause, not just to process content, but if you're going to use some of the active learning modalities that I'm going to show you in the next few slides, then you need to give sufficient time for learners to respond to a prompt or to respond to an activity, or even if it's just an open-ended question or a chat box question. I'm always tempted to hit the next slide button a little bit too soon. So Dr. Meka put in the chat, approximately 10 seconds, which could feel like quite a long time when you're presenting a session or presenting some content.
And different people find different ways to address that and to feel comfortable with it. I would say very, very comfortable with it. I can wait for a while and it does not bother me at all. One of the things that I personally will do is, and if you see me teaching in person or even here, a lot of times I'll be counting on my fingers just to make sure that I am giving sufficient time before I might clarify or add a little additional probing question or reframe the question for them.
Yeah.
But in other times, I have a colleague that one of her great tips, because she was incredibly comfortable with it, was she always had her big cup of water with her, or a cup of coffee or tea. So one of the things that she would do is she would force herself to take a sip. So she would put whatever the question was, and that was how she was able to hold the space, because otherwise she would keep talking.
Great. So to build upon this and some of the questions that you've asked, to talk now more about session content, we're going to transition a bit into active learning modalities.
And so you're going to, there are many of these that you already have mentioned and that you have already brought up, and many that we've done and that you probably have been using or have experienced yourselves. And you'll see that there are going to be some that are going to be very easy for you to build in. And again, if you think back to the triangle or the pyramid in terms of the class size, there are going to be some knowledge probes that you can do easily that don't necessarily require any technology or any additional types of follow-up or activities, to then things that might be a little bit more involved, that might go all the way to things like cases or team-based learning, or even some of your problem-based learning and cases learning that might come before that. So again, there's a whole spectrum, and depending on what your comfort is, as well as what your overall objectives are, and reflecting on what you think is going to best help students to achieve those objectives will help you to determine, what from this menu might I try and try to incorporate for the particular session design.
And I think the other thing to keep in mind as we go through these is that nearly everyone, if not all, are very easily convertible to an online or distant learning modality. So we'll go through some of them. And the first is retrieval theory or pause procedures. So learners who actively practice recalling outperform learners who use other approaches. This can also be known as the testing effect. So the instructor pauses briefly during the session to allow learners to clarify and assimilate. You're able to jot down ideas or summarize key points or identify questions. Then, one of the ways that we think about doing this is, potentially in a periodic pauses, quote unquote, lecture format where there may be, 12 to 15 minutes of lecture, and then you wait for a couple of minutes. You allow learners to work potentially in pairs to review and discuss material with one another. You can repeat this 2 or 3 times throughout the session that you're giving. And then in the last 3 minutes, you can have learners write down everything they recall from the session. I personally like to do things the opposite way. If I'm going to give a session on lupus, for example, I will let them take the first 3 minutes of that session to free recall everything that they can remember about that disease entity. And then I'll build upon that as I progress through the lecture. There can also be a guided lecture format where the first 15 minutes is lecture and the next 15 minutes are having learners get some protected time to write down notes on what they can remember and recall, and then to repeat that. So a couple of different ways that this can be incorporated into your teaching practice. A favorite of mine, think, pair, share, and this allows all learners to share their ideas with at least one other person. I've seen this modality used in national conferences, actually quite now increasingly more commonly. So it's you give your audience some time to individually think about a case or a prompt, maybe just a couple of minutes. And then you allow them to discuss that prompt with the person sitting next to them, or maybe, in a group of 3. And that you give them a little bit more time, maybe 5 minutes. And then you have pairs share their ideas with the group overall. You can call on everybody, you can call on certain pairs or a sampling. And you may need to adjust the time as needed according to the level of complexity of your prompt, or if you're combining 2 prompts into one, you can always adjust the timing, but essentially it allows them to do some individual reflection, bring some thoughts to the surface prior to sharing and discussing with at least one other person, and then reporting to the larger group overall. Some of the criticisms about team-based learning is at times the team dynamic. What do you do if you have a really quiet learner or a couple of really quiet learners versus 1 or 2 really outspoken learners? How does that affect the whole team dynamic? Think, pair, share is a nice way to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate. KWL, at the beginning of the session, you can ask groups, what do you already know about a topic? So you'll see some overlap there with testing effect and free recall. What do you want to know about the topic? And you can ask them to submit that to you on a piece of paper or via QR code or in the chat. Again, allowing you to tailor your discussion throughout the session or throughout the course. And at the end of the session, what did you learn and what do you still want to know? And again, you can have them submit those to you almost like an exit slip so that you can use that when thinking about how you may design future sessions. And thinking about an anticipation guide, this provides a focus for learning. It's important to give learners the opportunity to examine beliefs and what they already know about a topic. You can provide statements and ask the learners to agree or disagree. So almost like a true false that they would have done back when they were in, their earlier years of education. And then asking those learners to revisit that list at the end to revise their statements. And it's fun to ask how many of you changed 1 answer, 2 answers, 3 answers. Especially like these when it comes to teaching more challenging topics like softer skills or things that require, some empathy or some emotional maturity. It's nice to see what the evolution is, even in a 1-hour session. Exit slip we touched upon last time when we were talking about assessment, but just to reemphasize, it's used to help learners process new concepts, reflect on what they learned, express their thoughts. They're given a prompt, submit answers, like I mentioned, either on a piece of paper or electronically, and you can choose to follow up. So KWL is one variant of this that you can adopt, but you can also make it your own. You can have learners have identified 3 key ideas that were presented that day, 2 examples of how they may apply what they learned, and then 1 area of confusion in a 3-2-1 format. So 3 key ideas, 2 applications, 1 unresolved area of confusion. Audience response, very popular. Some of you put in the chat, top hat, poll everywhere. You can launch polls right through Zoom. You can do it in a sophisticated way, or you can do it really low tech, giving those TBL groups or giving the group placards or just literally pieces of paper with a 1, 2, 3, 4 written on it, or A, B, C, D. So learners can respond individually. They can do it in pairs. They can do it in groups. Typically, this is a multiple choice based question, and at a given signal, everybody displays their answers and can help the instructor to determine how well things are understood. And as I mentioned, low tech or high tech, and again, can tailor your content that you're delivering depending on how many people got that right, got that incorrect. A couple of general tips with active learning. Continuous periods of exposure to subject matter should really not exceed 15 minutes. That's the typical adult learner's attention span. So one technique, if you're giving a more traditional didactic to a large audience, would be to punctuate every 10 to 15 minutes with a short period of active learning. And that's what we've done here today with our chat box questions, with our breakout rooms. It's what we did last time with some of the individual exercises. So keeping it to, a 15-minute max. And I think if you reflect on this, I don't know when the last grand rounds you went to was, or the last conference you attended in your field, and, you're sitting there for a 1-hour didactic. How long did it take you before you were, checking out Instagram or thinking about what work you had to do later in the day? And maybe you got back and you revisited it, but chances are you didn't get potentially the most out of a straight 60-minute period of exposure to lecture didactic material. And we already talked about this, when posing a question to learners, giving that pause before trying to solicit an answer. The wait time is really important to allow learners to process and to think of their answers. And we talked about some ways to potentially ensure that wait time was provided. So we talked about a lot of interesting things today. Initially we started discussing adult learning theory and the 4 principles, making sure that things are relevant, things are immediate, that adult learners are involved in the content, involved in the evaluation, right? And then we spent time talking about problem-based learning and its effectiveness in smaller group sizes, team-based learning and its effectiveness in medium group sizes, prior to transitioning to a bit of time spent on didactic material. So what are ways that we can make our presentations visually effective, right? We talked about redundancy and some of the other things that Dr. Meka reviewed, tying it into the objectives, providing framing, providing timing, and then discussing opportunities and different ways that you can sprinkle in active learning theory after exposure to content materials. So we're going to put it all together now, what we learned today and what we learned last time, with an emphasis on making sure that there is alignment between objectives, assessment, and instruction.
So I put a few things through the chat, and I apologize for not putting the link earlier before, but the link that you'll see there, if you are not familiar with this, this is a wonderful resource that actually was originated out of a project and a grant at UB. And it is now housed on the NSTA website, which is the National Science Teaching Association. So this is basically a database of cases that can be used and have been designed for use in all topics related to from K-12 through undergrad and graduate school programs. across disciplines where they have a variety of different cases that you can take a look at. Some of them are free, some of them are require if you are not a membership, but they do, like I said, have a number of different free resources and free cases that you can take a look at for those of you who might be interested in taking a look at those that you might be able to use or potentially adapt in your own teaching. So that's a great resource if you aren't familiar with it. So you'll see that what we did include in the chat as well were two different handouts. So one is a Word document and one is a PDF. So the PDF document is just one that is just a handy overview or summary of some of the different strategies that just were reviewed. They include a few others as well as some references and some different ways that you might be able to use it just in case you are not familiar with all of those. And then the Word document is the one that we want to have you spend a few minutes right now taking a look at and using some of our time together to do that. So this is just an adaptation of a backward design or understanding by design template. This one in particular, Dr. Dan Sheehan is one of our colleagues here, and he modified it a little bit to include some of his own personal notes as well as some of the things that he wanted to be thinking about or remembering with his own courses, with his own planning. So you might think about updating this or annotating this with your own notes as it might relate to things you want to be ensuring that you are incorporating or thinking about or considering. But what you'll see is at the very top in the first part, it's just identifying a little bit more about the actual learning experience that you'd be participating in or leading. So that would be, who are the learners, how many, where is it, what are your overall goals, then getting into your overall objectives. So what are the must knows, what is it that you want them to be able to use, what do you want them to be able to, so knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, whatever type of language you want to be including there. And then what is the assessment of learning and what are your assessments for learning? So what might be some of those low stakes things that are going to be looking at to see if the learners are understanding the concepts or able to apply that knowledge or skills, giving you a few different ideas for objectives and how you might word those. So you can see that the Bloom's is incorporated there. There are some people who use an ABCD objective format, which focuses on like the audience, behavior, condition, degree. So, by the end of our session today, our teaching faculty will be able to describe the difference between some low tech and high tech active learning strategies that they can use with a variety of participant sizes. So you would include some of those things. SMART is again going to be very similar, in which you want to get as specific as possible. And our Bloom's verb, as we've talked about before, and as we spent time on last time and at the beginning of today, reminded you of, to be thinking about some of those higher order versus lower order thinking skills that you want to be enforcing or reinforcing throughout your learning experience with them. And then to use that middle part, step 3, which is going to be found more towards the end of the template, in which you would be starting to actually plan out what then are the sequence of activities that you'll be doing or hoping to do around how much time, and again, what extent will you be having a little bit more of teacher-led or facilitator-led or educator-led as versus things that might be more learner-centered, and what does that division of time look like within that particular session, and then how you wrap things up, and then what you'll be looking for in terms of knowing whether or not you are successful and your learners are successful in achieving their objectives. People might use different templates, or you might have different versions or variations of this, but this is one that we have found can be helpful in beginning to help to pull together and hopefully give you a different way to utilize many of the different approaches, strategies, and ideas that we've talked about so far. So I'll pause there for a second just to see if there are questions in the chat, or Dr. Kaye, if there's things that you want to add or highlight as well.
Yeah, I think that when using a new modality, it starts small, right? So what is one learning objective that you hope is the most important one, right? And how might you map that to an assessment modality? And then what is the best way to teach that? Is it a small group? Are you going to think about some problem-based learning, a hybrid model? But I think starting with one objective, how you're going to assess it, how you're going to teach it, and then you can expand upon that to include your other objectives. It can be overwhelming to write 5 objectives that you want to be able to accomplish in a session, and then jump to assessment and think, how am I going to assess these? Am I going to use the same assessment modality, different? How am I going to teach these? So I found it effective sometimes to break it down one objective at a time, but then looking at the end, do the overall objectives make sense? Are the overall assessment modalities redundant or overlapping? And then in terms of session design, is there coherence there? Does everything seem to flow together nicely within the time allotted for a session?
And we'll certainly allow you some time and stay on for a few additional minutes for those people who might want to take a look at it and start to actually utilize the template. But one of the other things that we did also want to incorporate and to ensure that, we brought up earlier in our time together today was this idea of cultural considerations. And so there are a number of different resources and different tools that have come out of our recent work and from many other institutions, in which you can find some different checklists to help to guide and take a better or closer look at your own work as an educator planning, as well as using it to hopefully take a look at some of the different resources, whether that's textbooks or websites or different materials that you might have. So I'll put in the chat the link to, so that you'll see here in the PowerPoint that you were shared that there are 2. So one comes from Upstate, and then this other one comes from Northwestern, and there are others, and many, many others that are out there from different institutions as well. But these are 2 that in particular we have used and we have found to be helpful. The one with Northwestern, you can take a look at in terms of being able to see a variety of different ways that you can be working through the checklist, to be looking at, are there things that are being addressed between racial and ethnic groups that are implied within my structure for my session, and some of the different questions that you can be asking yourself, right? Because sometimes you aren't sure until you start probing and digging a little bit deeper into what that might look like, or what things might be included or excluded that might potentially be including bias or reinforcement of some stereotypes. So this checklist is a nice one in which it allows you to just take a look at some of the main elements. And then if you aren't sure about whether or not you've considered these different areas and taken into account some of these different considerations, you can use those guided questions to be looking a little bit further into what might that look like. Thinking about things like the images that you're including, are they promoting diversity? If you aren't sure, what are some things that you would look for? What might that look like in terms of, are the images, do they include diversity in terms of body habitus? So thinking about things like ability status, shape, size. If you're looking at, when we are thinking about a variety of different types of presentations of data, are you doing it in a way that allows for everyone who might not necessarily have the same vision status being able to understand and interpret those results? Or are there things that you could add in terms of labels, or even changing colors of some of those different things? So this is just a really nice, useful, I find accessible resource to use to just walk you through some of the key things to think about, because oftentimes there are things that we haven't thought about yet, especially when we're using templates and images that are sometimes stock like that.
And I like the Northwestern one a little bit better. I think it's just a little bit more visually appealing to kind of click through, but I can share something personally that I've figured out as a result of doing one of these checklists. So I'm a big believer in highlighting key material that's going to show up on an exam, material that's going to show up on a board exam or a licensing exam, and I will often color code it. And upon doing this, I was like, oh no, like what colors am I choosing, to highlight the text in a physical color for the things that are really important? And it was ironic because I had completed this and I was like, I better go through the session that I'm going to give in a couple of days to make sure that I did this. Of course, I ran out of time and did not presented the session. And one of our wonderful curricular supports actually went through and highlighted in a different color all of the things I had put it in red for one of our students who was colorblind. And so it was just an ironic situation and a lesson learned for me in terms of what I found on this checklist that actually manifested just a couple of days later. So it is important to do this because even in the best intentions, there are things that we just may not consider. And so for us, we will hang on. We talked about a lot today. We wanted to give you some time here at the end to look at that backward design template, to start to think about it, to explore some of the links and references and resources that we've shared. We will start next time by, asking you guys for any areas of uncertainty that you would like us to clarify from today, and make sure that we build in some protected time to do that. But thank you for being here with us, and we'll hang on here as for anybody that has any outstanding questions or anything else to add.